Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, folks who are here and with us on Zoom. Today's presentation is The Art of Storytelling in Words, Pictures, and Sound. And today's presenter is Jake Halpern. Jake Halpern is a journalist, best-selling author, and the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. As a journalist, Jake has written for the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He is the host of the Deep Cover podcast for Pushkin and is a contributor to the This American Life and NPR. He teaches writing at Yale University, and he is here also with his dad. So welcome them both and enjoy today's presentation. Thank you, Jake, for coming.
Thank you guys for
your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to have a great father-son trip with my dad. So I have a presentation. I think it should run maybe in the 20-minute range, and then we'll open it up to questions. For those of you that don't know me or much about my work, I'm a jack of all trades. I've written magazine articles, op-eds, nonfiction books, young adult novels, graphic narratives, and I like to switch it up. I do it, I guess we'd say, many genres, although I'm not a big fan of the word genre. I think of it more as format. I'm a format switcher. This was me in my 20s. Dad, you may remember, this was the period of time where I was not gainfully employed, where I was wandering around, and I've spent my life as a freelance journalist, which meant for a great many years I made very little money. The benefit of that was that I was able to chart my own path. And this was both wonderful because it gave me tons of freedom, but there was also moments where it just didn't seem like it was a wise choice, though my parents, to their immense credit, never made me feel that way. As a freelancer, you're kind of at the will of whoever will hire you, and you often don't get paid much. I like to say the series that I'm best known for, that we won the Pulitzer for, was a 20-part series in the New York Times. It was a year's worth of work. I got paid $14,000 for that. And I say that only because it's important as the story goes on in a few different ways. I think that this kind of life, where I was always singing for my supper, had some interesting and unexpected consequences that I'll talk about. This is my office at home in New Haven, Connecticut. And one thing I'll say to any of you that are aspiring writers, it's really important to have a space to work that feels good, where there's good sunlight, where there's good energy. It could be at a coffee shop, it could be at your gym. It's one of the few spaces that you can actually control and try to channel the good feelings of. The truth is, though, my job, for most of it, has felt like a hustle. For a long time, I never turned down any job I got. And I think that's why I've tried these different formats. It was just looking for work. But I think at some point I realized that this strange, eclectic, multi-format journey that I'd taken was an education of sorts, because each of these formats that I kind of unwittingly stumbled into taught me something valuable and unique about the craft of storytelling. I started off in print journalism, first doing very short pieces, like 1 page or less. This, over time, as I proved my ability, allowed me to do longer pieces, which were both more fun and more challenging. Pieces like this one in the New Yorker that I wrote about a safe house for refugees in Buffalo, New York. Over the course of my career, I've written a lot about refugees. I was lucky in this instance to get a ton of space, about 10,000 words. But we are living in an age of dwindling attention spans. Even when you go to the Times, it will often say now 3-minute read, 2-minute read, which is somewhat discouraging for me, because I don't know how you're supposed to actually feel much of pathos and humanity for our fellow human beings in a 2-minute read. And I'm not sure what that means for the future of journalism at times. But I guess I would say I quickly learned that even when you have a ton of space, even when you have 10,000 words and many pages, sometimes print, especially that very fine, smudgy New Yorker print, fails to convey the full humanity of a story. And sometimes you really just want to hear the voices of the people who the stories are about, hear that tremor, the brimming of emotion in their vocal cords. And I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to play for you a portion of an accompanying audio story. Remember, I said I did a 10,000 word piece about the safe house in Buffalo. I did an accompanying audio piece for the New Yorker Radio Hour and about refugees who are coming to Canada via Buffalo. It's easier to get asylum in Canada typically than the United States. And so they would go to this safe house in Buffalo. Actually, my dad is now a volunteer there. It's called Vive. This is in the basement. I took these pictures with my cell phone. Whenever I'm reporting a story, if possible, I take pictures with the cell phone, not for publication, just so I can remember what it looked like. So when I'm sitting down months later, I can try to conjure a little bit of the feeling. So I was there. You can see these folks. There's the Canadian flag, which is going to be, I think, more important than ever post-election, as a kind of beacon for migrants and refugees. And there was a woman named Sister Beth, and she was one of the nuns that ran the place, and she kind of took me around on this first day. And as she was taking me around, she introduced me to a guy named Ulysses. And Ulysses was from El Salvador. He had a 16-year-old son, but for complicated legal reasons, Ulysses couldn't enter Canada. So his son had to continue along the journey and enter Canada alone. Okay, let's listen just a little bit of this story with Ulysses. Cursor.
Ulysses' 16-year-old son went to the border alone. He was admitted. He's now applying for asylum, and he's living about 2 hours away in Hamilton, Ontario, with another refugee family.
Mm-hmm. You know, I love my son. I have only a son. He's all for me, and I am all for him. So it's hard, but he working hard there. He is in the school, in the high school. I talking every day with him in the phone. And in a time he say me, "Hey, Dad, my friend invite me for go to the Niagara Falls." And I thinking, "Oh, I want to see you,
Niagara Falls is actually only about 20 minutes away. The problem is stepping outside of the building posed a real risk for Ulysses. Border Patrol agents, they circle sometimes, and the chances that he'd get picked up were real. But he just wanted to see his son.
And I say, "Hey, I want to see you. I want to go for the Niagara Falls in the US side, and he in the Canadian side."
I know the spot he's talking about, and there are these big metal binoculars you can put a quarter in and then look across Niagara Falls and kind of just barely make out the Canadian side. And that's exactly what Ulysses did. Put in the quarter, looked in the viewfinder, and saw the blurry image of his son waving to him in the distance.
And then we see, too far. Yeah. You understand me? Yeah.
At that moment, Sister Beth swoops in. She puts her arm around him and just very tenderly escorts him back to her office.
I don't know if it's because I'm a father of 2 boys, but I can never hear that audio without choking up. If you had read all that, what I had just played you, just the words, the transcript, you'd lose so much. There's something about hearing Ulysses' voice that allows you to feel his anguish, to really sit with it. It's not just what he says it's so powerful, it's how he says it. It's that moment that gives you the goosebumps and for a second allows you to imagine what it's like to see life through his eyes. Of course, sometimes audio is not the right format for a given story. Like I did an expose on the inner workings of the debt collection industry, and it became a book for FSG called Bad Paper. When the book came out, the New York Times Magazine excerpted it as a cover story. And the editors, they had this idea. They wanted to illustrate how complicated the world of consumers it was for consumers to navigate debt collection, all the choices they had to make, all the consequences of those choices. And so they came up with this. I remember trying to fact check this. It was like impossible. Me and the editor were like following the arrows and trying to, but it was meant to be the schematic that showed the complexity of the world. And after spending a long time on it, I was like, this is not working. This is not conveying what we want to do. And so we went back to the drawing board and we came up with this, which is a video game in which you could play either the role of the debtor or you could play the role of the collector. It's not exactly what my kids were asking for the holidays, but it served the purpose of showing this kind of interactive ability to learn. And it's where the reader could change the outcome of the story depending on the choices that they made. I basically recreated a choose your own adventure book. Some of you who are my age may remember these from childhood. And I want to be clear about this, and I tell this to the people at the Yale English department, which, God bless them, can be a little snooty. I don't look down on books like this because I've discovered you can both learn a lot from reading and writing books for kids and young adults. There are those in academia in particular who dismiss the young adult genre as not being serious or smart. I think that's really unfortunate and honestly an outdated mindset. As far as I'm concerned, all that YA means is two things. There is a specific point of view. You're seeing the world through a kid's eyes. And two, there is a specific audience, kids, although there are plenty of adults who read these books too. Now, anyone who's ever told a bedtime story to kids or younger siblings or grandkids or nieces or nephews, you know they are not an easy audience because they're smart and they're not afraid to ask the dreaded question, why? Why did she say that? Why did they go into that door? Why would he ever do that? To which you must come up with an answer. So I am a young adult author, and this is me facing the music. This is probably the scariest thing I've ever had to do, which is talk to about 800 middle school students about my YA book. Because these kids, they let you know really quick if your story stinks. And you can see it on their bored faces in the front row when it happens. And it's very both illuminating and discouraging at once. Here's another event that I did. This visit went better. You can see me signing this kid's book. Much of what I've learned about writing for young audiences, I've learned from my own kids. And I remember when my family and I lived in India for a year, I was on a Fulbright, and I was writing this story for the New Yorker about a treasure that was locked away in a vault beneath this very temple. And here I am, by the way, with my two boys, and we're going to a nearby temple. And one day my kid says to me, Dad, isn't that the temple that you're writing your story about? And I said, yes. And he said, what's your story about anyway, Dad? And I said, it's complicated. To which he said, yeah, you didn't answer my question. And so I was left to try to explain my New Yorker story. And I tried to do it in the simplest way I could. Now, not dumbing it down, just telling a story that might hold his interest. And about 2 minutes into this, I thought, holy cow, this is how I should be writing my New Yorker story. And it was a revelation because I believe that a story at its heart should be simple, it should be understandable, and it should enthrall everyone, even and perhaps especially a third grader. Or to put it another way, I believe that you should be able to tell any story, no matter how complicated it is, to a 7-year-old in a way that they understand. And if you can't do that, that probably means A, you're telling the story wrong, or B, it's not a story. My nonfiction writing has also gotten a lot better because of what I've learned as a YA writer. Because to hold the attention of a young reader, the storytelling itself must be very taught and disciplined. And that doesn't mean formulaic, by the way. It just means that you need to stay focused and be deliberate about the narrative choices that you're making so that you hold and command the attention of the reader. I should add, you may have noticed in some of the previous slides, I did use AI to create a few of them. And I like to use AI to create images when I'm brainstorming an idea. For me, it's a helpful tool when I need to visualize something quickly. But when it comes to published work, I always work with an illustrator, someone who can feel the pathos of the story, someone like Michael Sloan here, who you see is an amazing illustrator and is my dear friend. Michael and I worked together for years using comics to tell the story of refugees, most notably in our series, Welcome to the New World. Now, ever since childhood, almost all of us have read comics in some fashion or another, whether it's Superman or Snoopy or Calvin and Hobbes. The experience of reading comics, it is baked into our childhood. The idea of reading by the fire on a rainy day. And this format just has a way of humanizing the subjects, of making them accessible, which appealed to me. Now, Michael and I wanted to tell the story of this young guy right here. At the time, he's 14 years old, Naji Aldaban. He's a refugee from Syria. We met Naji on the very day he arrived in the United States, Election Day 2016. You're looking at a photo from that day that I took with my cell phone. What had happened was The Times had expressed an interest in me doing a graphic narrative about him. I connected to this guy named Chris George, who is the director of IRIS, who's our local refugee resettlement agency. And Chris said, why don't you be there on the day that this family arrives? But there's a family arriving 2 days from now on election day. You can be there and witness it. And I said, Chris, how are we going to handle the issue of consent? Because I can't write about them if they don't want me to. And so we worked out this understanding that I would be there on election day. I would wave to them, I would capture the moment in my head, and then I would circle back to them, say a week later, without the refugee agency, and say, hey, would you be open to the possibility of me writing about your family? Okay, so show up here, meet the family, wave to them, capture the moment, go home. This is 2016. My own publication, the New York Times, was predicting Hillary Clinton 92% chance going to win the election, which ended up being completely untrue, as you know. I remember waking up, clear as day, 2:30 in the morning, stumbling from the darkness of my bedroom into my study and seeing that now iconic Times headline, Trump triumphs. And my mind went to this family. And I thought to myself, they landed in one country and they're going to wake up tomorrow morning in a different country. And I don't know whether it was just that. I think the storyteller in me knew there was an opportunity here, where there was the small story of this family and the bigger tectonic story of the politics, the geopolitics of the moment shifting. And otherwise, I would say there's probably not unfamiliar to some of you here, this sense of waking up the next morning and thinking, I have to do something. This election that is so much bigger than me did not go the way that I personally wanted it to go. But is there any way that some small, possibly insignificant, maybe significant way that I can channel my energy into something? And it became this family. So I knew that I would need a translator to help me go and speak with that family. But I knew enough that it's not going to just be any Arabic speaking translator is going to do. I needed ideally a Syrian, someone that had both the language and the cultural affinity that could connect with the Aldeban family. So I reached out to this guy, Mohammed Hafez, who lives in New Haven, where I live. He is an amazing person and artist. He's an architect by training, but I had written about him for the New Yorker. Mohammed has created these incredible three-dimensional architectural renderings of the ruins of Damascus. They're enormous, and this doesn't even begin to show you the scale of it. And then it was done that really just takes to the next level is when he was still in Old Town Damascus, he did all these audio recordings of street life, and he wired the ruins with tiny speakers from the life of Damascus before the war. So you're standing, if you can imagine, surrounded by these models of ruins, and you're hearing these ghostly voices of the life that existed on the streets of this place before the war occurred. Just goosebump kind of stuff. So I called up Mohammed and I said, Mohammed, I want to approach this family. I think there's an opportunity to do some really powerful storytelling here. And will you go with me as my translator? But I also knew that Mohammed knew me, so there could be an element of him kind of vouching for me too. And he said to me, Jake, I'll help you out, but I'm going to be honest with you, I do not think this will work. He said, you are a non-Arabic speaking, non-Muslim, Jewish guy who doesn't know much about Syria. I don't think they're going to talk to you. He said, quite honestly, I'm all the things that they are, and I work with refugees, and they often don't open up to me, even though I'm Syrian and they're Syrian. So I applaud what you're doing, but I think that it might be wrong-headed. And I said, I totally hear that, and I acknowledge that that is possible, perhaps even likely, but can we try? And he said, I will try for you. So we go. This is Mohammed on the left. This is Isa, the dad. This is actually after he's taking us back to their house. We get back to the house. We meet the family. And I had the good fortune that Mohammed was the first Syrian that the family had met in the week since they arrived. So for like 45 minutes, I just sat there and let them talk and connect. And eventually, Mohammed says, like, Jake has this idea about writing a story. Would you be interested? And the daughter there is playing on a little toy stove. He kind of looks at her and kind of gives her kind of a little, honey, out of the kitchen, please. She leaves. And Isa launches into this story right off the bat, unprompted, about the day Assad's henchmen came to his house, took him to this detention center, which was basically a dungeon, made him wait in a giant holding cell with his brothers and other people that had been rounded up in one of these mass roundups. then called him into the questioning room where there was a rubber tire, contorted his body in such a way that the back part of his body was crammed in the tire and his lower back was exposed on the other side of the tower, and then beat him on the exposed lower back until he confessed to being a spy and being whatever else they had accused him of doing. So Muhammad is translating this back to me. I'm not thinking we're going to go here, and I'm not even sure. And I said, Muhammad, what, like, why is he telling me this? Does he want to like share this story with me? And Muhammad and Isa are talking, and Muhammad says to me, Isa says to tell you, Jake, that if you can get the truth out there and it strikes a blow against the Assad regime, he would absolutely wants to do this. So I felt conflicted at the moment, to be honest, because on the one hand, this is what I wanted, right? I wanted him to participate, but I also wasn't entirely sure that at that moment that he appreciated what it would mean to have his story in the Times. I didn't know I could do it right. Muhammad's doubts were my doubts. Who are you to tell this story, right? I took that seriously. And I remember early on when we were reporting, and I was back with Muhammad and I was interviewing him, he turned to Muhammad and he said, can Jake assure me that if I participate in this series for the Times, that the Trump won't come after me? And it was odd because I had this immediate instinct to just say, oh, yeah, you're fine. And then I said, no, I can't actually. And that was the truth. But Isa was still set that he wanted to do this. We agreed we would change his first name. We'd just use simple first names that were changed. Anyway, the Times is very reluctant to do this. We worked on it for 3 months with no pay, but we kept on pushing it along. And finally, they committed to doing a full page with a 20-box comic in the Sunday Times. So as a journalist, you're never supposed to show copy with your subjects. It's a basic rule of journalism. And I was like, this is a rule that I think has to be broken this time. And what I did was, as Michael sketched out in pencil the 20 boxes, and it was the story of how the family had left Jordan and come to the United States on election day, and how grandma and the rest of the family was still in Jordan waiting to come here, and that now that Trump was in power, that the family's chances of ever seeing one another were seeming quite remote. And that's what's told in this 20-panel thing. So we get to his house, we get back to the house, and I remember this very well. There was still only one chair in the living room, and there's no hospitality like Syrian hospitality, I've learned, because of that one chair. They said to me, that's for you. No, I can't. I realized I have to sit in that chair. So I sat in the chair, we laid it out on the ground, and Mohammed Hafez went through every single box, explaining to Isa and his wife, Amina, what was there. And I'm watching, because mentally I'm prepared that if he freaks out at this moment, which would be understandable, I have to walk from this thing. And Isa's looking at it, and he's looking at it, and he says, box number 17, the ride to the airport in Jordan. I went in a 2011 Mitsubishi Lancer. That is not a 2011 Mitsubishi Lancer. And I said, Mohammed, is that his only change? Yes, that's his only change. And it was like, thank goodness. And so it ran to print, and it was an odd thing because it then ran in the Times every week. And slowly people in the New Haven area started to figure out who they were. And one beautiful thing happened, which was that as the series progressed and the secrets started to get out, the family, I won't say they became famous, but they became, people would say, you're the family from the series, you're the family from the series. And it was a beautiful thing. As a storyteller, what you hope for is that the people that you write about will feel empowered by their narrative, which I think is the way they felt. Okay, so I spent the next 4 years following Naji. So Isa was the one brother. Ibrahim was the other brother. Isa is the one that had the little girl by the stove. Ibrahim, the other brother, had Naji, who was the teenage son. And he's the one who I really end up becoming closest to. And I spent the next 4 years, more or less, following this family. I went to school with them. I went to work with the parents. I went to mosque with them. I was at their house when they got this death threat that became part of the story, that was absolutely true and absolutely scary and part of the series in the Times. This is an event at Iris when the family is getting orientation, and I'm talking to Naji. Naji had little English at the time, but he had this beautiful confidence to use the few words that he knew with me. And then Michael is drawing. You can see there doing his kind of renderings. Now, in creating the comic each week for the Times, the challenge for me was that aside from that first week where we had 24 panels, most week we only had 8 panels or boxes to tell the story. And you can see one example here. I'm showing the pencil sketches that Michael did as he played with the story design. Each sketch represents one draft, and as we got more certain about the storytelling, he did finer and more detailed renderings. This particular strip tells the story of how the family fled Homs, Syria, and took their house key with them, hoping that someday they would return. We glimpse all the places the key has been, and in the last panel, the family receives an update on their house, a video from their neighbor back in Syria. In the next set of panels, which you don't see here, they learn that their house has been destroyed. Here's the finished version. Now, by necessity, the storytelling in these 8-box comic strips is compartmentalized. Each panel must justify itself and in some way move the story forward. Often the panels with no or very few words are the most powerful because they allow the story to breathe. For me, the lesson here was about distilling story to its most elemental form. 8 panels, 8 boxes, 8 moments that matter and that somehow together form a bigger and more powerful story. In our New York Times series, the POV kept on changing. We saw the world through Najee's eyes, but we also switched up and saw it through his father's and his mother's and his uncle's. When we actually turned this series into a book, we decided to tell the story almost entirely from the point of view of Najee and his sister Amal. And to do this, we tried to get creative with the visual storytelling and really try to imagine what the world looked like through Najee and Amal's eyes. This is a story that I love of Najee on his first morning in America seeing a squirrel and thinking that the squirrel would become his pet. This is Najee and his family exploring the house that the resettlement agency had provided, and we rendered it as a board game because to them it was mysterious. What's this thermostat has no AC? What they'd never seen a pantry with all these dried goods. But the scariest, of course, was the basement. They have few basements in Syria, and so when they venture downstairs, they're all kind of terrified of what's going to be there, and then realize it's a washing machine, to which Najee says he will never, ever be coming down here alone. It's important to have these moments of levity. People make the mistake of thinking that refugee stories are just sad, kind of two-dimensional narratives, but of course, all of our lives are filled with humor. They're filled with moments of lightness, filled with hope, that are living side by side and overlapped with the despair and the dread. Here they are being shuttled around by a team of senior citizens who are their assigned drivers, who one of them always drove so fast. This is Najee and Amal, his sister, talking about their drivers. Amal is saying, "Remember the other lady, the one who drove us and when Harold couldn't?" Najee, "Yeah, I think maybe she died." "Died? Seriously, why are all our sponsors so old?" Najee, "Seems like people here work really, really, really hard, and when they get really, really, really old, well, they take care of refugees," which I thought was lovely and included in this. This is another scene where Najee befriends his upstairs neighbor, and she tells him that she has a whole host of health problems and that she wears one of those emergency bracelets so if she falls, she can hit the button and help will come. And he says, "And someone comes if you push that button?" "Yes, of course." Najee thinks to himself, wow, nothing like that back home. And remembering people fleeing the ruins of homes and imagining what would be, how improbable it would be that there would be a bracelet on their wrist where someone would come for trouble. Before I want to do this, I want to say what made me change the POV to Najee was a story that I learned only after I'd been about a year into the reporting, which is what I knew, but I didn't fully appreciate, that it had been Najee the one that was pushing his mom and dad and siblings to come to America. Najee, at the age of 14, had somehow gotten it in his head that America was going to be a place where they would all live a better life, where they could realize their dreams. I don't know if this is from watching Hannah Montana or some cartoons that they watched, but this is what he believed, and pushed his father and pushed his mother. "We have to go." And Dad saying, "But my mother," Najee's grandmother, "doesn't have the visa. Going means breaking up the family." And the father is trying to convey to Najee that this was not a simple matter, that by going to America when they did, the family would be severed and might not be reunited. And Najee pushed anyway, to the point where Ibrahim, his father, told me one day, he pushed me to the point where at times I hated him. And I knew this was a man who loved his son. but Naji pushed. And then when they come to America and they're here about, I don't know, 3 months, and they get a death threat saying someone's going to come to their house and kill them, and the FBI gets involved, his sister Amal comes to him and says, "Are you happy? Is this the America you were telling us all about when we were back in Jordan?" And in that moment, Naji carries the weight of pushing his family to come here. And I get the goosebumps again about this because I realized this is a YA novel. That's what this is. And Naji is the most powerful point of view on this story, in my opinion. But I will add again, it was over a year into my reporting before I had that rapport with Naji and with Amal, where they could say, this is what happened. And then to be able to go back to mom and dad and Naji and Amal, and all 4 of us sit down together in fact-checking and saying, this is how I'm rendering it. And have the bit where Ibrahim says, at times, I hated him. Are you okay with that? Yeah. And their relationship strong enough that Naji understood that there was a difference between he said he didn't hate his son, but hated how hard he was pushing. The target audience for this book was both adults and young people. It was actually published by 2 imprints at once, Metropolitan Books, an adult imprint, and First Second, a young adult imprint. This was done largely for marketing reasons because the YA imprint was very good at getting the books into schools, but it is the exact same content. And this underscores my core belief that a good story should appeal to everyone. And it's not helpful or to get too hung up on what genre it is. A story is a story is a story. This is one of my happier moments. I was sharing this. Michael and I won the Pulitzer Prize for this. The family was not able to come, but I will say that it was one of my great other pleasures to call up Ibrahim and Isa and tell them that I had won, and then I was splitting my prize money evenly into, broke it into thirds, and then we all got together and celebrated afterwards. My younger son looks exhausted in this picture. He was actually quite happy, and he's happy because this is the attendant. My wife's name is Kasia Lipska. She kept her maiden name. And there's Kendrick Lamar at number 2. So he thought it was just marvelous that mom was only 6 or 7 spaces away from Kendrick Lamar. And when Kendrick Lamar arrived fashionably late to the great Columbia Rotunda, and David Remnick, the storied editor of The New Yorker, started striding across the hall to meet Kendrick Lamar first, he was beat by 4'10" Lucian Halpern with the Pulitzer Prize pamphlet for Kendrick to sign it, which afterwards he said to me, "Dad, how much is this worth on eBay?" And I said, "Son, he signed it. He inscribed it to you. It is worth nothing to anyone more than it is to you." He also asked me when I got the call that won the Pulitzer, we were getting on a plane trip to Spain. And it was actually a surreal moment because we got the call. We were lining up. Me and the boys and Kasia were lining up. And I saw the Times call. And I picked up and Jake, this is Jim Dow from the New York Times. I have some wonderful news. You and Michael have just won the Pulitzer Prize. And I was overwhelmed, like tears, I think, just streaming down my face. And I think it was all those years of doubt, all those years where I wasn't making a lot of money, all those years where I thought, am I deluding myself? Why am I doing this? And then this moment. And my wife thought someone died. She's like, "Honey, what's up?" I said, "We won the Pulitzer Prize." And then, God bless my youngest son, said, "Dad, does this mean we're going to fly first class?" I said, "No, we're still in the shitty economy seats." But yeah. I have been going for 40 minutes, so I'm going to stop here.
Extended that welcome to everyone else. So
Okay.
yeah, take your time.
I'll tell you one last thing, and this is apropos because it's about my children. I always say, and it's not just a line, and I learned this from my father, the most important job I ever had is being a dad. I've written about my children a bunch, and this is an excerpt from a piece I had in the Times earlier this fall. I'm just going to read to you a little bit from it. "My youngest son, Lucian, who is now 15, has a fatalistic streak. He recently observed to me, 'The world is falling apart, isn't it, Dad?' His proof, which was ample, included climate change, power outages, Ukraine, Gaza, and the protests on the college campus near us. And he didn't seem convinced that any of the world's supreme leaders, as he called them, were doing an especially good job of it. 'How much faith in general do you have in adults?' I asked him recently. 'Oh, not much,' he replied. 'Have you always felt this way?' I asked. No, the world was better about 10 years ago, he said wistfully. But I never really thought about that kind of stuff back when I was 5, because back then I just thought about what I was going to have for lunch. Fair enough. In one of my conversations, Lucian told me, Dad, it's not a matter of if there will be a nuclear war. It's a matter of when. He had this look in his eyes, a gleam of defiance, as if he were daring me, the resident optimist, to disagree. I was at a loss for words because, truth be told, I had been inching my way towards that same terrifying realization. The only question was whether I was willing to offer him some grand reassurance that we would both know was a lie. My wife, Kasia, as far as I can tell, feels far less conflicted about discussing the apocalypse. This is perhaps because as a child, she had her own brush with Armageddon. When she was 11 years old and still living in Poland behind the Iron Curtain, the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl had its meltdown back in '86. Her mother and stepfather managed to glean tidbits of information over the crackle of their radio via Radio Free Europe. Everyone feared the worst and scrambled to get hold of iodine pills because they can protect the thyroid against the effects of radiation. Initially, Kasia's parents couldn't find any. Eventually, they learned that a friend of a friend who lived across town had some extra pills. They rushed over, but by the time they arrived, the friends explained that they only had 2 doses to spare. My parents gave the pills to me and my brother, Kasia recalled. Her mother and stepfather didn't minimize the gravity of the situation. Their approach was to give the kids as much information as possible. Their goal, they later told me, was to build trust with their kids so that they could all respect and depend on one another. This vector of trust was tested a year or so later when her parents chose to hide subversive underground newspapers in their apartment. They initially were vague with their children about what they were hiding, but later came clean. Their unity, it seemed, was predicated on truth. This is still Kasia's approach to life. She's all about the facts. Perhaps not surprisingly, she went on to become a scientist, an endocrinologist, who incidentally knows a fair amount about thyroids. The truth is, Lucian is right. The world is coming apart. I see it from his perspective now. He's grown up in an age in which COVID closed schools, forest fires darkened the skies, hurricanes intensified, and rioters stormed the US Capitol. My instinct was to minimize all this, and it was wrong. On some level, I just didn't want to admit to my kids or to myself that I was powerless to protect them. This was, at heart, a lie that would only undermine their trust in me. The real problem with my approach, however, is that I was robbing my kids of a sense of urgency, a sense that the situation in much of the world is dire and that it demands their attention. So I've embraced the Iron Curtain response of my wife. Yes, the world is broken, which is why you need to fix it. Lucian's response to this, of course, is, we didn't break it, you did. Touché. He also reminds me, if you can't fix things, what makes you think that I can? And my only reply is, maybe you can't, but you still have to try. The end. At this point, if you have any questions, I'm only too happy to answer them. Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And obviously through this, we see like the importance of words and how they kind of help shape a story and get into people's hearts rather than like for them, right? And like take away from like the narrative.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I've noticed about your work is that it's accessible, right? Anyone can read it, whether it's a young adult or someone older. And in the scholarly space, for those of us who are grad students, we're kind of struggling with that, right? Because in the scholarly space, oftentimes scholars want big words. They want something that's not as accessible. So I guess like throughout your work, how did you navigate that? Or like, did you go through issues that are similar to that, where like you had to kind of, you were told, oh, your work is, it needs to be, I guess, fancier. And like,
Yeah.
what was your response to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I do take some solace. It is my understanding that your mentor here is a poet, and so that you have some people who appreciate the value of brevity and the right word and not always using the 50-cent words. So that is one thing, is that you're going to get mentors who you may disagree with and who aren't paying what you feel is sufficient respect to the integrity of your own voice, to the story you want to tell. But to the extent that you can hold on to those people who can also serve as mentors, even in an unofficial capacity, that can nurture that voice, the story that you want to tell as you want to tell it in the words that you want to use, hold on to those, because you need those people that protect that vision that you have, that reaffirm, no, you're right. You may have to do it this way on this occasion to get it in this article or to kind of make a name this way or to pass this thing, but do not by any means for a moment give up on the vision of the story that you want to tell and the voice that you have. Your voice is, if you give up your voice, don't ever give up your voice. That is the most profound and integral thing that a writer or a storyteller can have. There are times where you have to compromise because your audience is very particular about what they want. And it's true when you're younger, all the more because you have less power. Because an editor comes in and says, if you want to be in our publication, you have to do it this way. This is the way we do things. This is the way the world works. That's fine if you want to do it, but if you want it, and you hear that a lot. And to some extent, you have to play ball with that. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to just give the world the straight arm and never compromise. But I think that simultaneously, you can continue to create work and hold on to the dream of telling the story in your own voice on your own terms. And as you gain credibility and as you gain respect incrementally, and you start to push back with this is my voice, then they have less power over you because you've established yourself. And then by the time, hopefully, you're older or even just a little further along, you have that space to start telling the story. So I think has to be some compromise early on. And it's tough because when you're young, you have less agency. But I think it's just a commitment to yourself that I'm not giving up on this thing. And I say this with the highest level of respect. My father is an academic. I teach in an academic institution. There are a lot of academics who are very poor writers, but no one ever tells them. So, and I know that may ruffle some feathers, but I believe it to be true. So I would take it with a grain of salt. And regardless of whether the academic is a good writer or not, again, your voice. You give that up, you give up something so fundamental to who you are. Yeah.
So I'm from Lebanon and I worked as a journalist for 6-7 years in Lebanon.
Wow.
I focused on refugees.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
When I was covering refugee problems in Lebanon, I got like so emotionally affected.
Yeah.
Especially when I covered how they live in the camps and like I followed the story of a kid who I tried like to help him with his medications, and a year later like he died and the situation in Lebanon didn't get any better. So I felt that all the work that I'm doing is not changing anything. So I was like so hopeless and I stopped I was like, oh, I want to stop like journalism and I left the country. And my question is like, how do you have like your emotions live with the family for a year? This is like a lot to take, especially if you are so empathetic.
Yeah.
I can't like be detached from story.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate?
Well, I feel like I could probably learn more from you maybe than you could learn from me about this. I've not reported from inside refugee camps for that extensive period of time. And first of all, just so much admiration for that work. Good for you. And you may think that it may not have changed things, but you never know who read your story and who that resonated with. So it may have done more good than you realize. I think that I don't know how you can write a story in which you expect your readers or listeners to feel sorrow and pathos and anguish and heartbreak and not experience those very same things yourself as the storyteller. I think that that's what's so hard about it is that we are a conduit for these stories, and it's a burden on the storyteller. Of course, it's hardest on the people who are afflicted by issues like war and starvation and et cetera. But it's also hard on the storyteller because I think in order to do your job well, you have to feel the pain and despair and the hopelessness of people involved. And I think that I want to believe that you did a very smart and wise thing, which was that you gave yourself a break so that maybe you could return to this or in some other way. You have to, if you just drive yourself into the ground, you can't do the work that you need to do. And so what I think is one of the reasons that I think I've changed the formats that I tell the stories is sometimes the stories do get me down. And then I just need to take a break from it. And I'll go into doing something really different for a while. And then I get an itch. And I'm like, want to go back and want to do something that I feel that matters. And so I think that actually what you did, what you're describing to me sounds like you're already doing what I would encourage you to do, which you do something until it feels like it's too heavy to carry, and then you put it down for a while, and then maybe you come back to it. And maybe there's ways you come back to it that aren't as quite as heavy as being in those camps. Maybe it's, you know, a resettlement story in the States, or maybe it's a story that's very different, but I don't know any way to do the job meaningfully and well if I'm not struggling and torn and a bit heartbroken and anxious that I'm getting it wrong and that I'm not doing justice to the truth, or I'm not doing honor to the people whose stories that I'm doing. Like that space, I remember as a younger man, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and thinking to myself, what is wrong with me? Like, I can't sleep. I haven't slept in like 3 nights. Do I have like an anxiety disorder? And then just realizing this sucks, but I think this means I'm doing my job. Like, what's the alternative? That I sleep like a baby and I'm totally divorced? Like, maybe, but that's not happening, you know? And so I don't know if that helps. But yeah.
The US is more like, there's hope here more than like other places, despite everything that's happening.
I think so. And I think also as I get older, I ask myself with every story I get into is I say, this is a world I'm about to get into. Let's be honest here. The next week, 2 weeks, month, year, I'm going to be in this world. Am I ready to be in that world? And that's also a question to ask. Because if you're not ready, then it's not, yeah. But yeah, I find the stories of people like Naji to be like deeply hopeful. Like all the shit he went through, all the things he went through in homes and then coming to America and everything. And that he like, when you meet him, his like positivity, his warmth, it's like, it's unbelievable to me. Every time I meet him, I just think like, my God, I'm not a religious person, but I feel like I witness grace. I felt that the other day when I did an interview with a guy who'd been incarcerated for 27 years and survived by being an artist, and just thought, my God, the resilience of the human spirit. People make this fundamental mistake. They think these are depressing stories. No, that's wrong. That can be true, but that's a fundamentally wrong blanket assumption. These are often stories of unfathomable resilience and optimism. Yes.
Have you ever told a story about someone who then took offense
Yes.
at how you told their
Yeah.
story? What did you do?
I did a story. Yes, it's inescapable. And it's the every time I do a story, it's like a high wire act. So with the Aldebans from this story, my fear was that they would come back to me and repeat the words of Muhammad Hafez. Who were you to tell this story? You messed this up. You don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you didn't bother to ask us, you appropriated this story, and we regret trusting you. That was the fear that ate away at me for 3 or 4 years. And it wasn't entirely a bad thing, because I did everything I could to get it right. And I tried to proceed with the maximum amount of humility and the greatest assumption that I would get it wrong. And when we got through those 4 years and there was friendship and respect between us, there was this sigh of relief that was just so enormous, because I had gotten through it with them, because I have seen what it looks like when it goes the other way. And I'll tell you a story about it. I wrote a story for the New Yorker. My father knows this story, about a guy that I had gone to high school with, very bright but poor Black guy who had done time in prison and came out and found work as a debt collector. And I wrote about him for the New Yorker, and then I developed that New Yorker story into a book. And he was a complicated, beautiful, like joyful, sorrowful character. It's just everything you could want. And we had something approximating a friendship, although it's always difficult when you're the writer and there's the subject. And when the book came out, I asked him if he would talk to a reporter from NPR as a favor to me to help get the word about the book. He said he would. So I went and met with him, met with the reporter. I introduced them. They talked. Now, in the book and in the New Yorker article, I didn't use his real name. I used just his nickname, Jimmy. And when the NPR reporter got to the end, he said, "How should I identify you?" And he said, "You can use my full name." And I said, "Jimmy, are you sure about that?" He said, "Yes." The thing ends. I go back to him again. "Jimmy, are you sure about that?" Yeah, I'm fine with it. The NPR story comes out and Jimmy hates it. He feels that it like depicts the industry in a very bad fashion, that I think he didn't say this, but like a lot of what he liked about my story, which was kind of more the personal aspect of it, the personal narrative was not there in the NPR story. And he felt that I had asked him to do this for my book and that I had betrayed him basically because this piece that came out was not what he felt was the similar kind of story that I did. And he let me have it. He really did. And I went into depression. Now, you remember, Dad. I mean, I was devastated. I wrote him a letter. I tried calling him. Years passed. I thought about him. It ate at me because I think on some level I was like, why did I do? I didn't need to do it. And it was not my intention, but it's what happened. So anyway, many, many years later, someone calls me and wants to turn the book into a TV show. And I'm like, okay, a fictional TV show. I said, but I got to bring Jimmy in on this. So I push and say, we need to buy the life rights and negotiate for the life rights of people that are involved, even smaller characters. Jimmy was a smaller character in the book. They said, okay. So I called up Jimmy and my wife said, what are you expecting from this call? She said, are you expecting him to tell you all is forgiven because you're bringing him into this project? Or do you want to bring him into this project because you think it's the right thing to do? My wife is awesome. And I said, I think the truth was a bit of the former, that I was hoping that this would mend our friendship, but I'm going to approach it as the latter because I do think it's the right thing to do, that he did talk to me for this story. And if I can get him something for it, that feels like the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not he ever likes me again. She said, then do it, but go in with those expectations. Okay. Track down Jimmy through his brother, get him on the phone, start telling him about the project. Yes, thank you for thinking of me. I would love to participate in this. He's like, I'm in a much better place now. I'm no longer living in Buffalo. I'm living in another city. I was in a bad place before. I'm just, in general, a lot of healing has happened since you talked to me last. And it was an opening. And despite what I said to my wife, I jumped on it. And I said, Jimmy, I have to be honest with you. What happened in the past, it was never my deliberate intention to hurt you. But you talked to that man because I introduced you to him. And if I could go back, I would undo it. And I have to take responsibility for it because I'm the one that made that introduction. And I should have done more. I was a younger man and I was worried about my book sales and I should have done more to protect you. Even though it wasn't my intention, it's on me. And I am so damn sorry. And he said, it's okay, Jake. I knew that. And we had this this moment that I had hoped for in my heart. And I don't pretend to think that that always would mean that we're all best friends or that pain had never occurred or that, but there was a moment to reconcile where I got to say that and he heard me and I was able to speak from my heart and he spoke from his heart and some healing occurred and I said to him, Jimmy, and this is the God's honest truth, I say, I am better at what I do. I don't know if this is any consolation to you, but I am better at what I do because of what happened. That's not something that will happen again. Or if it does, I will do everything in my power to not let that happen again. It goes back to your point. It's like, part of you may wish you didn't care, but I don't know any other way to write about stories or in which you don't have these sorts of complicated relationships and acknowledging that they're complicated and just trying your damn best to be a decent human being and understand you're going to fuck up sometimes and trying to make that as small the percentage as you can. Yes.
You mentioned having to recognize recognize a lot of the aspects of your very intricate dynamics with each individual character
Yes.
or person that you're trying to tell that you're trying to bring the story.
Yes.
And for me, it reminds me like the idea of having to recognize that people aren't perfect. And I was wondering, how do you maintain knowing, or like, how do you, we've kind of gone over it, but how do you maintain understanding that you're imperfect and while you're creating or while you're drafting all these narratives, while also at the same time recognizing that the industry itself isn't perfect and they have a lot of common tropes that they're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah.
How do you, and then also alongside with all the success you're receiving as well, for
Yeah.
the way you're telling your narrative,
Yeah.
how do you follow the idea that maybe my way is better?
Oh,
How do you
great question. I often fall into the trap of thinking my way is better, but luckily my wife reminds me that my way is not. No, but I think that is true. With, remember what I was saying before, you were asking about voice, right? And how to protect the voice. I think what happens, you'll see this with people when they get to be, I'm 49, right? So I've had some success. You see the people like me who then have a chip on their shoulder, which is to say they were young and people were telling them to do it my way. And then they held on to their voice. And then they get to be like in my position where it's like, now people aren't telling you what to do it. You have more freedom. The danger is precisely what you say, is that you have that big chip on your shoulder and you think, well, I know what I'm doing and I know my way. And I think that that's where you've got to begin with, have people that give you feedback that tell you respectfully, I think you're wrong here. And then you have to hear that. And so like with the podcast that I do, it's especially helpful because I have a small team of people and they will say like, I see why you're doing this, but I think this is not working, or this is wrong, or this story is too cliched or a trope or this or that. And then I have to do the work of not doing, oh, well, you're younger and less experienced than I am, therefore I'm going to just plow ahead. Or is it like, is it possible that I'm wrong, that I'm not telling this as well as I should? And I think you have to be honest with yourself in that kind of space. So that speaks to one part of it. But it is true. You're dealing with I'll tell you a story that happened at the Times. I was doing a story about a scrap metal collector, and there was a debate. They wanted to clean up his language. Okay. He was like a super bright guy, not like a great deal of formal education, but he spoke in his own, what I thought was like a really authentic, original kind of Buffalo dialect. And it was cool. That's why I liked the guy. And they wanted to clean it up because they thought that they could be accused of making fun of him or looking down on him. But it was like, it wasn't accurate. Like they were just covering themselves. Like he spoke the way he spoke. And so my way around it was, I said, I may do a radio version of this story. And then there's going to be two ways that this guy is speaking. And how do you want to explain that? And they said, okay. So I think that like there's, on the one hand, you have to advocate, and I think you hit it really well. Like you have to advocate for what you believe in against sometimes the bias structures that you work within, but then you have to hold yourself accountable too, which is harder when you get older because you get stuck in your ways. And my wife's joking that I'm moving the shit on the coffee table like this and that because she thinks I'm OCD, which I probably am. But like, because you get older and you get set in your ways, and you think like, I'm tired of being humble because I want to do it on my own terms, and that's like no good. So rambling, but hopefully that addresses some of your question.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
What's the difference between your voice and your vision for the work? And imagine your voice might change and a vision for the work that also evolves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think of voice, typically when I think of voice, I think of like tone, narrative tone, language. If I'm writing first person fiction, it's that. If I'm even writing a New Yorker story, it's the way you describe landscape and setting and the way you describe a character. That's all the way, so that it's not like, doesn't feel stodgy or you're just imitating the house style, that you feel there's some originality in your language. That to me all falls into the aspect of voice. And most clearly, like first person, like the story that I read to you here, this is my voice. Even if, by the way, it's somewhat of an artifice, even if I'm like hamming it up in some ways that I don't usually talk, that's still all my voice. I put that all in the bucket of voice. The vision for the story is really tends to be what is for me it is, can you tell me a narrative arc of the story? Can you create characters that feel original? Can you resist cliches? That kind of thing.
But what you mean by voice is what is basically, it's not like something that's consistent. It's like the voice you've chosen for the piece.
Yes.
It's not like the voice that you began with that you've always had from day one.
Right, exactly. No, that's right. That is important. It's not just a kind of like, I have some innate voice that is being stifled by my editors and that has to come out. It's more like when I say voice, I mean your expression of your unique style of storytelling, of the way you describe characters, of the way you use dialogue. That's all, I put that all in the bucket of voice. Because what you're going up against is what you would say in a publication is called house style. That's a version of what you're dealing with in academia. It's house, and academics are not the only one that do that. I mean, every newspaper, every magazine has a house style. Get in the house style or get out. And so when I say voice, I'm saying you cannot just give up, you can't become a slave entirely to house style, or you can't be entirely kind of, you know, worshiping at the altar of house style. You have to somehow hold on to your own more unique rendering of how you want to tell story. I put voice in that kind of broad description. Yes. When I've been in places like when I did some reporting from a refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece, at a camp called Moria, and to be clear, we were at the time it was a terrible. They've overcrowded these camps, and I was reporting around the camp because we actually couldn't get in because there were riots. But we were there, yeah, there. But there it was also clear they didn't even. It wasn't even like I won't go on the record with you. It was just a kind of like you felt. I don't want to talk about this. And then you could just, okay. And it didn't, but yeah, you could absolutely feel that. The odd thing was I was expecting more of that. I thought that would be like 75% of the people that I encountered, and rightfully so. What I was amazed was that how many people did want to talk about their experience. That was amazing to me. There's one story that I will tell you that I was at that camp in Moria, and I had taken a group of students, college students, there to do the reporting with me. And we went into this overflow camp on the outskirts of Moria. And we had a guide. We had an amazing guide who was himself a refugee, who was an Afghan refugee who was serving as our translator. And so I was very concerned because I had the students with me. And so we went into, and he said, come in, you got to see this tent. So we go into this kind of very squalid, I would say, dark tent. And he introduces me. And he says, who would like to introduce themselves? And one at a time, the men in the tent said, Ahmed, Baghdad, architect. You know, Ibrahim, Damascus, science teacher. It was actually, they said many, many things after that, but the most powerful moment was the moment that in even the squalidness of the tent, each of the 10 men kind of squared their shoulders, sat up, said their name, and said their occupation. It was like this profound voicing of their humanity. Like, I am not just this guy in this tent. I am this person. And so that is these moments where I underestimated that people would want to share some even small part of their narrative, and that there would be something kind of affirmational about that. There are other times like the Audubons where Adiba, the mom, even after I known her for like a year and a half, would start to tell a story about when her husband had been abducted and she was watching the children, and she would start to cry. And then I would stop and I would say to Muhammad, the translator, and eventually her English got good enough that we didn't always need the translator. We don't have to do this. Let's call it a day. Let's stop here. We do not need to go any further. And I have to say, in every one of those moments, she would say, no, it's okay. And she would continue. But I felt like one thing I had to do was just like, here's the off ramp. Let's, you know, yeah.
So in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about freelancing. And
Yes.
kind of being in that space of uncertainty. And I'm an undergrad, I'm a freshman, and I want to go into journalism.
Awesome.
And so I also have that fear of being in a space of uncertainty.
Yes.
And I guess my question is, how do you stay motivated, and how did you kind of keep going and have faith in yourself and your work?
Well, I mean, many reasons. One of whom is sitting there, my father. Never once did my mother or father ask me when I was going to go to law school and get a real job and get serious about what I've done. And my wife, these people that you have to surround yourself with that believe in you. Like those are things that you not only have to be grateful for, but that you actively have to draw close to, like that they help you guard like the flicker of the flame, right? Those people are important, and you have to hold them close and appreciate them and cultivate them. So that's one thing. I think it goes back. Sorry, what's your name again? Yara. I think that why I was very moved by what Yara said was that when you start, especially if you're doing nonfiction, you get out in the world and you witness something like what Yara did and what journalists and witness. And there's this sense of like, I can't unsee what I've seen. And I feel this thing inside of me, and somehow it is incumbent upon me to make someone else feel that thing that I feel. And I don't know if I can succeed in making them feel the feeling that I feel, but not trying is not an option. And I think that as you venture out and talk to people whose stories are calling you to be told, that right there is one of the most powerful things, where once you've heard that, then you have to follow through with it. And you're going to hear a lot about how journalism is dying and this and that. There will always be room for storytellers. And that I can tell you, I wasn't a great storyteller when I was in college. I wasn't a great storyteller through my 20s. I just was too freaking stubborn to give up. And over time, I slowly got better. And so this idea of like the innate talent, I don't believe in that. I believe in craft. I believe in perseverance. And I believe with time, craft gets better. And when craft gets better, story gets better. And when story gets better, editors stop barking in your ear about in-house style. It's all part of this trajectory to storytelling. And you have to somehow find a way to nurture that, to hear the stories and try and fail and surround yourself by people that protect you. And because there's nothing sadder than the person you meet at your 20-year college reunion who tells you, I wish I would have done that, but I just didn't have the guts to do it. And sometimes people have damn good reasons for saying that, because they had to support 3 siblings who needed to go to college. And that's like beautiful. And I wouldn't quibble with that. But if you have the chance to follow that thing, do it, and do it in like a way, and try to see how other people have done it. Try to map out those other paths. Yeah.
So you're now teaching craft.
Yes.
I'm curious about how you balance that with your own writing, your own journalism, and then unrelated, curious what Najee's up to.
Oh yeah. I'll start with Naji. Naji is pursuing a career in law enforcement. And so he yeah, he's doing well. There's a lot of pressure on him to provide for his family. So he's not married. He's probably in his mid-20s. I'm having lunch with him on Saturday, so I'm gonna have more of an update. I thought he was gonna get a job as a state trooper. He now tells me that he's working for the time being as a corrections officer, which makes me like, that's a hard job. As the kind of quasi-avuncular figure, I'm like slightly worried about that. But I think he's gonna be fine. He's the, yeah, so that's Naji. Oh, craft and teaching. Well, look, I mean, it's why I came here today, which is that I think that the danger with just doing the storytelling and the writing is that there's too much time in your own head. And what we yearn for as humans is connection, of camaraderie, of friendship, of teaching and of learning, because I learn a lot from my students too. And so I think that they fuel one another. And I was just telling my dad today, I was just saying, I'm really looking forward to my class starting in January, because I miss the students. I miss their energy, their optimism, their aspirations, because you see their idealism and their dreams like yours, that you ask yourself, how am I going to do this? And that question begs me the question of saying, am I doing what I said I was going to do when I was 21 or whatever you are? I mean, that's the beautiful thing about being around young people, is they're following their dreams, but by doing it, they remind you to ask yourself, are you falling into complacency, or are you, so to me, the teaching is something that I find kind of spiritually nurturing. And yeah.
Yes, and after Andrew, did you ask?
No.
Okay, but there's a question from over there. Then Andrew.
So my questions are very long-winded. My answers are very long-winded.
No,
Yeah.
Yes.
Writer's block. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's never been a time where I was so down that I couldn't like write a word, in part just because I felt like I had to do it to pay the bills. But there were prolonged periods of doubt where I did not feel good about what I was creating or hopeful about what I was creating. But I think it was like I knew that I just had to keep on writing, and that would come back. The doubt is ever present. And sometimes weirdly, like the more successful you are, the more sharp the doubt is. And I think that like what I always say to my students, and I believe this from my heart, is that I say, I teach a young adult fiction writing class. And I say, our job in this class is to band together and push out the doubt. Now, doubt is different from criticism that is useful to making it better. But the doubt is the, who are you to try this? What makes you think you can do this? What makes you think this is as good as all these other people who are so good at it? That voice is insidious. And so, yeah, that's there. And learning how to navigate that and form alliances that push that back, that's like a lifelong pursuit. And I would put that in the same category as writer's block. It comes from, it's where writer's block comes from, I think. And often I say to myself, the first 200 words I write are generally shitty, but then they get a little better. And then somewhere in the middle, I'm going to write something good. And then maybe at the end, it goes back to being shitty. But you need to get through that first 200 words where you're not beating yourself up over the head saying, this is so bad. How could you do this? How could you write such a bad sentence? This is so cliche. That's the movie you watched last week, dummy. You need to get through those 200 words to get to, so that's all part of the right, like where it's like, okay, this is not going to be great, but I have to keep going and maybe it'll get to something better. And so that's kind of like how I think about the writer's block. Yeah.
I was just curious in the context of the graphic novel works that you've done. So when I started undergraduate, I started in sequential art. So one of the concepts that was consistently talked about within that was this idea, like you're not telling a single story,
Yeah.
you're telling two potentially more. because you have what you're saying physically with your text.
Yep.
You have what you're showing with your images, and you have the relationship between those.
That's right.
When you're working on an incredibly nuanced story, like the one that we're talking about here. How do you make the decisions around what elements you're showing versus telling? Was it, for example, like I guess, how did you work with the illustrator in that to try and determine the most accurate way to represent such a, I guess, human experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at first I did a very poor job of it. I was saying things in dialogue or text box, which were apparent in picture, and which was a waste of words. So it was exactly as you say, is like saying what is the picture saying and allowing the text not to say, so that the words can be very kind of economically chosen. We also use very few like text boxes. Sometimes you see the comics, we used almost entirely dialogue and thought bubble, but we didn't use what I forget what the technical term is, but the box up top where it's the voice of the narrator, which is like, this story takes place in this and this. We tried to rely on the pictures to do all that work. And then also, and this is something that I learned from dabbling with like screenplay adaptations in my book, is that not using dialogue to tell story in a clumsy manner, like using dialogue as a way to depict character and not have people say things that they would not normally say. Like you're dropping in on a conversation between two people who've known each other for years. There's many things they wouldn't say because it would be implicit to their relationship. So all that took a lot of figuring out to do. Is what I would say. But I think that finding that right balance was crucial. And then learning to appreciate, the boxes where there is no text. I learned. I didn't know what I was doing. I did not know what I was doing. And I think there was a lot of bad versions of that where I was not listening to the interplay between text and picture that you described early on.
My question was, I was trying to, when you said you were 49, I was trying to just kind of figure out your career. The New York Times went online on January 22nd, 1996, which is maybe around the time your journalistic career.
Yeah, I graduated from college in 97. So it was.
You were probably writing for, I don't know where you went to college, you were probably writing for the university or college newspaper then. So what I'm saying is that your journalistic career began with journalism online.
Yeah.
Borders was doing a brisk business. Barnes and Noble was doing brisk business. Shortly thereafter, America Online was the biggest company in the world.
Yeah, that's right.
Everything was happening. Shortly after that, Amazon showed up, and then books began to disappear.
Yeah.
So, and then right now, I can't imagine, because of the phone and others, I can't imagine reading, like I order books on print for my students, but I can't imagine reading a book on paper all the way through. I need it on paper, I need it on the screen, sometimes I need it on the phone. I find that I'm reading multiple, so, but you're kind of doing everything.
Yeah.
So in terms of writing, and also, I don't know if you imagined yourself when you were writing that you were going to write young adult books or the graphic novels and so on.
Yeah.
That was sort of on your mind. So given that maybe you had imagined digital writing or online or all of this, and that you've kind of, multi-formatting or platforms or whatever, and you've been successful at navigating all of them, what has remained consistent since you've had this career where you've been rolling with the changes, if you will? What has remained consistent with all the changes that have occurred in storytelling, in media, in everything? What has remained consistent?
I mean,
what has been, if you will, the secret to your adaptability? Both of these questions.
you need you do need space. Like it's very hard if you only have 100 words or 200 words. You can do it, but it's very, very hard. So what I look for is mediums now where I have space. So the podcast has been great because I have 6 hours over six. I have 3 hours over 6 episodes. So I do 6 30-minute episodes in my narrative podcast. So I have a big canvas. So what I would say is like the constant is always storytelling. Like, can you tell a good story? Can you make me care from the beginning? Can you make me feel that this is not a story I've already been told? The challenge with refugees is like, if you start the story in a tent in a refugee camp, it's really hard to keep the reader on. If you start the story somewhere very unexpected, and then you lure them in to this other narrative, which they might think they might not want to read, then they're with you because you're not playing to their expectations. I think that the key is right off the bat is starting in a way that opens the story in a way that feels fresh, so that they're not the reader or listener is not feeling they've already heard this story. That is probably one of the most important things you can do. And it's a challenge. And that's often my challenge. So the beginning of the story is always, and that doesn't matter what the format is. I mean, I think it's a challenging environment right now because everything is online, because it's 2-minute reads, because places like the Times value the articles based on clicks. Like that article that I showed you, this one, the Sunday as it got published, I got an email from the editor basically saying it was performing well. Like it was trending. I forget his term, but that was not something that existed pre-1996. No one knew what was trending. No one knew whether it was like, it could have been a really important story. It could have been a good story, but this idea that like we can quantify its value based on clicks is a new thing. And it has quickly become kind of a god of journalism because it's directly correlated with advertising, which is correlated with revenue. So that's tricky. That is, now sometimes you can get lucky and you can tell a story you want to tell and it also gets clicked. But by the way, our Welcome to the New World was not a big clicking article. I think our readers were more print readers. I think some of the reasons that the political coverage skews based on clicks. So that's real, and that's changed things. And I don't know what the answer to that is. But I feel like the constant is storytelling. And I'll leave you with this last bit because I know we're running late here. The last bit of closing advice for you that you can hold on to. When you are a freelance journalist, or even when you're a staff writer, you pitch a story. And you pitch almost always an impartial information. You hear a little bit of the story. You make 1 or 2 calls. You think you know what the story is. And then you confidently stride up to the editor and say, this is the story that needs to be told. This is how I'm going to tell it. I'm just the person to do it. Please allow me to write this article. Okay, but you're promising this story based on your research, which constitutes maybe 5% or 10% of the research you're going to do if you're greenlighted. Well, guess what happens? You get into it, you start reporting it, and inevitably, the story that exists is different than the story that you pitched. Because you start talking to people who are saying, well, it's not really like that, or it's more like this. And then what happened, especially when I was younger, but even now, is it's like, oh shit, I promised this editor this story, and that story doesn't really exist. It's actually more like this story. So how am I going to go back to the editor and provide this new story? And my friend Jack Hitt, who is one of the original This American Life guys, people, said this amazing thing to me once. He said, you will always encounter a moment where your reporting does not conform to what your pitch is. And that is the moment that you have found your story. Because what you're pitching on is based on impartial information, but it's also based on templates of other stories and movies and books that you've read. Your pitch is often a cliche because it's impartial information plus generic story implant that you have in your head. But reality is not a template. Reality is chaotic. Reality is unexpected. And so what Jack was saying is like, when your reporting doesn't conform to your pitch, it means it's because you've discovered something that is spontaneous and organic and unexpected and beautiful and original. And that is the moment that you should say, hallelujah, I'm telling this story. I'll leave you with that.
course, is in some ways the difference between what we've been reading in research, which is that immigrants that are waiting in camps and so on, sometimes wait for 20 years.
Yeah.
Something called waithood, where it's really anticlimactic and inconclusive and so on.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to works of art and journalism and so on, especially in countries that receive people, there is the impulse of closure, and if I may add, the impulse of advocacy for the refugees.
Yes.
To tell a happy story.
Yes.
And so, and that's because we want these countries to welcome these people. And I think that that's kind of the tension between the reality of a really complicated, unhappy, inconclusive existence and the desirable welcome of having these people who are ambitious and who often do have happy endings when they arrive, which doesn't happen to a lot of them. So how do you kind of negotiate between what is kind of like a pitch and what is a less, a gray, more likely reality? To stay longer.
No, it's okay. It reminds me of the thing of one editor early in my career saying you want fully fledged characters, not cartoon characters. But what happens when you're stuck with cartoons as your menu? You need characters that are complex. And the thing is, I would say it's not just readers or listeners or viewers that want this. It's people like at the refugee. With the volunteers that are helping refugees, there was a time where they got really upset because one of the refugees was taking all the gifts that they had been given by the community and selling them on eBay. And they're like, and asking for gifts and then selling them on eBay. And they're like, this is wrong. And when I talked to the refugees, because they were sending the money back home. And here's my point. It was as if the people that were caring for them just wanted the simple pleasure of saying, oh, you hapless people, I'm going to provide you gifts and you're going to be happy. And this is all going to conform to like this kind of welcome to America. And it's a happy story. And they're like, oh, you want to give us an iPad? Great. If you give us 2, that'd be great. Okay. And then they sell them both because their brother is like almost starving back in Syria. And it's like, well, I didn't say this, but I thought like, what did you think? Like, how did you think these people survived and made it to America? Like, of course they sold the iPad and turned it into money and helped their family. Like, but it's like, and to me, that didn't diminish them. Like, I didn't think that they were like lesser or bad. They just were complicated. And I think that like, so I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we have this idea that that our characters and our stories have to be simple. But it's like Ibrahim saying to me, Naji pushed me so hard to come to America. At times I hated him. And I remember when I heard that, my initial reaction is that doesn't sound like the good, lovable dad that I want to portray in this story. And then I realized belatedly, oh my God, that's so powerful. This man who loves his son is saying that he pushed him so hard to leave his mother that he hated him at times. That was actually the most interesting thing that happened in that dynamic. But it was not simple. It was not neat. It was not Hollywood, but it was real. And the realness of it is what made it effective because you could empathize with both of them. And so I think this idea that we have that I say in my presentation, story should be simple because I think storylines should be clean but characters are fundamentally complicated. You can have a simple story narrative that's clean with characters that are complicated, if that makes sense. And so I think there's this idea that I don't want to use Ibrahim and Naji as propaganda to rebuff Trump's Muslim ban, because that will dishonor them and that will dishonor me. I have to have faith that the complexity of Ibrahim and Naji's story, with warts and all, will evoke some sense of humanity that in its totality will send a message that the intelligent reader can at least question or think about, but must resist the temptation to create propaganda, even if I dislike this president or dislike his policies. And I say that with certainty in my voice, but great deal of kind of back and forth and conflict in my head as I'm creating this thing.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you for having me.